Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to do, it's kind of a series review, kind of a why you should read, but I just finished the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell and I loved them so much that I knew I had to review them. I find it hard to do reviews for every book in a series because I feel like you lose people along the way who haven't continued with the series, and it's hard to cover all the books in a series while still remaining spoiler free. So I think this kind of series review or why you should read works a little bit better and will hopefully convince some of you, if you were thinking of picking up the Warlord Chronicles, or maybe if the Warlord Chronicles were not on your radar, that this is something that you should be reading. This was absolutely a 5-star series for me. I loved it. And I am, just to provide like a little bit of context, I am a big fan of Arthurian retellings at baseline. I have read a lot of them. I have read a lot of the classic ones. I have read some newer ones. I've read middle grade, YA, adult. I've read kind of the whole range of Arthurian retellings. And this one to me felt very distinct, very unique, and very realistic. This is, I would think, your go-to series if you are interested in a retelling of Arthurian legend that feels like historical fiction. I would very much classify this as historical fiction over fantasy, but I think that it has a lot of great crossover appeal. Even if you're not someone who reads a lot of historical fiction, and I am certainly not someone who reads a lot of historical fiction, I think if you like mythological or fairy tale retellings, if you like heroic fantasy that's very battle focused, if you like fantastic characters, if you like excellent writing, then this is the series for you. I think Bernard Cornwell does everything right in this series, and it creates this trilogy of books that is truly a pleasure to read. So if this is your first experience hearing about the Warlord Chronicles, I cannot recommend them highly enough. And over the course of this video, I am just going to tell you a little bit about what they cover and why I think everybody should put them on their TBR. So to just, I guess, begin, like I said, this is a historical reimagining of the Arthurian legend. So the author, Bernard Cornwell, who also wrote the Sharp series and the Saxon series, has said that these books are some of the very favorite books of his that he has written. He is a big fan of Arthurian legend. He is clearly very well versed in the mythos, in the history surrounding the figure of Arthur, and he wanted to create a series of books that could imagine Arthur as the man he could have possibly been. He has obviously done a lot of research for these books in order to create a world and create a story that could feel very true to life. And as I said, he took the figure of Arthur and based the story on some of the earliest historical record of Arthur the person. So in his author's notes, which I find really fascinating, I loved reading the little notes that Cornwell left at the end of these books because it described a little bit about his process and a little bit about how he began writing these books and the sources that he used. In some of the earliest sources that he could find that made reference to this figure of Arthur, he was referred to as a warlord. He was not described as a king or as the once and future king. He actually was mentioned in passing as a warlord or a winner of battles in Britain. So Cornwell kind of latched onto this idea of Arthur the warlord and then created a story that wove in the parts of the mythos that we all know, that everybody knows just from popular culture or general knowledge, and he created a truly unique story. The setting here is very similar to other Arthurian retellings. So we start the story in Britain in the Dark Ages. So this is 6th century Britain, and it is immediately following the retreat of Rome from Britain. So we have the Romans pulling out of Britain and leaving behind some of their military tactics, some of their strategies, their beliefs, some of their gods and goddesses, their architecture, some of the changes or the kind of modern upgrades that they brought to Britain have all been left behind, and we are left with a Britain that is struggling. And obviously, the further you go back in history, the harder it is to get solid historical records. But from the information that is provided and from the information that Cornwell is using to create this tale, we find a Britain that is in turmoil. So there's a bunch of different threats that are all culminating, that are making Britain a very difficult place to be. So they have the invasions of the Saxons from the east, they have the invasion of the Irish from the west, and then they have all of this infighting. So Britain is split into various territories, all of which have their own rulers or kings, and there is infighting in Britain. So these kings are always at each other's throats. And this is the stage that we are set upon. The story is actually narrated by a character named Derval. So Derval, as we find out at the very beginning of the book, is someone who knew Arthur intimately. And he is looking back on his own life and reflecting at the events that led to Arthur's rise in power and led to Arthur trying to make some sustainable change for a more peaceful and cooperative Britain. So we get this character of Derval, who is advanced in age and is writing a memoir or a history of his life and his life with Arthur. And the story opens up with Uther, who is Arthur's father, and he is the ruler of Britain. And his heir, his oldest son, has recently died, and he wants to name a new successor. So he wants to name a new person as king, to follow as High King of Britain in his footsteps. And so that's the stage that we open up on. And because we are seeing this story through the eyes of Derval, we see it from the perspective of Merlin. So Derval is actually a captured Saxon slave who was sentenced to death and then crawled out of the death pits, which are these giant pits that druids used to use to throw children or people into to kill them when they were undergoing a siege. And Derval crawled out of one of these death pits, which was seen as a good omen from the gods, and that he carried the touch of the gods or the luck of the gods. So Merlin, who is a very powerful druid and had some connections to Uther, took Derval from this death pit and brought him to his own castle to raise him. So we see Derval, who is growing up kind of on Merlin's grounds in his manor, and becoming friends with some of the other characters who have gathered around Merlin. And we see the events of Uther's Britain unfold through the eyes of Derval. So that's how the story opens up. We follow Derval initially as he is a child, and all of these political events are taking place in Britain. And then the trilogy, the 3 books, follow a period. It doesn't actually ever tell you for sure how long the period is, but it seems to be somewhere around like 30, 35, or 40 years of Derval's life. And because Derval is tied to Merlin, and if you know the Arthurian legend, Merlin is also tied to Arthur, Derval and Arthur do come into contact with one another. And we follow, from Derval's perspective, as I said, Arthur's rise from a warlord or a warrior who fought under his father Uther to his rise in power in Britain. So it's a very interesting setup, and it's a little bit different than anything else that I have read before. I have definitely read Arthurian retellings that have not been narrated by Arthur or who have been telling the story of Arthur. Some of my favorite Arthurian retellings are actually Mary Stuart's books, which follow the perspective of Merlin, and we get to see the story of Arthur unfold again from that person who is a little bit removed from the main legend. But I thought this is really interesting. Derval is based, I think, on a combination of characters. So he's based on a character or a historical figure, Saint Derval, and then also based on one of the knights of the Round Table who kind of comes in and out of some legend. So I think Bernard Cornwell took aspects of a couple of different characters and integrated them into his own version of Derval, who becomes one of Arthur's best friends. But that is the general setup. And book 1, like I said, opens more on Uther than Arthur. So if you go into the story and you're expecting to see like Arthur and his quest for the Grail and his heroic deeds right from the beginning, it can be a little bit disconcerting because you are very much put into Uther's court, and you start to discover a little bit about the volatility of Britain, about the politics of Britain, and about what is really happening at this point in history. So it is a little bit of a slow start, especially if you are waiting to get to Arthur. But in part 2 of the second book is when Arthur shows up, and that's when the story really starts to take off and you really start to get sucked in to everything that is happening. One of the reasons that I think this retelling has been so successful and why it has captured the hearts of so many people who have read it is because of what Cornwell does with the characters. So even though he is building this representation of Arthur that he wants to be historically accurate, and he mentions this in his author's note, he did pull some characters who did not enter into the Arthurian mythos for a little bit longer. So the character of Merlin and the character of Lancelot are actually characters who kind of evolved as the history of Arthur evolved. But in Cornwell's words, he couldn't really write an Arthurian retelling without Merlin. And if he brought in Merlin, which wasn't really sticking to that straight historical accuracy, then he also could draw upon the character of Lancelot. And I am really glad that he did, because Cornwell's Lancelot is the most distinctive Lancelot that I have read, and he is the most hateable character that you will ever read. I guarantee you, this is not one of those things that will be up for debate where you have some people who like Lancelot and some people who hate Lancelot. Lancelot is a toad. He is a slug. He is the worst. He is one of the most vile, reprehensible characters that I have ever read in anything, in any story ever. And I was reading these books along with Alan from the Library of Alexandria, and we would look for new insults to use for Lancelot as we were talking back and forth about this book, because he was such a hateable character. But Cornwell really is able to bring out a lot of emotion about many of the characters in these books, and they are all so well written. There are no paper thin characters here. There are no heroic warriors. There are no mustache twirling villains. These are all very realistic portraits, very realistic creations. All of these characters feel real in a way that I think is really rare in fiction. Cornwell has made me want to go on and read more of his books just because of the character work that he has done in these 3 novels. The character of Derval, who is the narrator and our eyes onto the story, I dare you to read these books and not fall for Derval. He is brave, he is compassionate, but he is also fiery. He also loses his temper. He has flaws to balance out his very real strengths. Cornwell's Arthur is a character that you will admire and also want to shake by turns, because he makes stupid decisions. He is ruled by his sense of honor, almost to the detriment of everybody around him. He has this belief that you need to maintain the oaths that you make, and that this is how Britain will become the land that he wishes for it to be. His greatest wish is to bring peace to Britain, to unite these fractured kingdoms, and he believes that upholding the law or maintaining your oaths, which were essentially what the law was in Dark Ages Britain, your word is your oath is the law. So Arthur is steadfast in that particular very blinded type of loyalty, to the detriment of himself, of his friends, and of the country at times. The female characters in this story are phenomenal. So the main 3 female characters that we get are the character of Cynwyn, who is a princess of one of these fractured kingdoms. We get Guinevere, who, as many of you know, is the person who is romantically involved with Arthur, though I think that this story will tell that tale a little bit differently than the ones that you have known. And then we also have Nimue, who is a druid who works under Merlin. So Nimue kind of pops in and out of Arthurian legend. There are some stories where she is the focus. She's very highly, very integral to the story. There are other stories where she's known as the Lady of the Lake. She pops in and out, but she plays a very large role in this story. And Nimue and Guinevere in particular are characters, again, where you will find your feelings toward them cycling. There will be times when you admire their strength and their courage, where you will empathize with them for growing up as women in this very male-dominated world. And then there are times when you will just want to slap them, where you will think, like, what could you possibly be thinking? And I think that for characters to draw such visceral reactions out of you is just a testament to how well an author can write characters. There were full-on rants that I sent to Alan, or Alan had sent to me, talking about the actions of a particular character, the decisions of a particular character, the beliefs of a particular character. And it was so much fun to talk about. And I think, like I said, is a testament to how well these characters are written. I cannot imagine anyone writing these books and not feeling emotionally attached to the characters, because I think you have no choice but to feel emotionally attached to them, and B, just those emotions going out of control sometimes, because whether it is hatred or love or sadness or frustration or pure anger, you will run the host of emotions during this book. The things that happen will make you feel things. So if you like books with high stakes, where you are emotionally invested in the characters, then you must read this series. The character of Merlin, who is, again, one of the main characters along with Derval and Arthur, is also a portrayal of Merlin that I feel like is very distinct. If you have watched the Disney version of The Sword and the Stone, with kind of the elderly, doddering Merlin who's a little bit off in the clouds and kind of funny, the Merlin in this retelling is like that, but R-rated. So he's also like lecherous. He has very little care for people's lives unless it can benefit him in some way. He is dismissive. He is arrogant. He talks down to people. And despite all of those things, I believe that you will love him, because it is almost impossible not to enjoy Merlin. His character fits so well within the context of what Britain was at this time, of the position that he holds in society, because this is a time when Druids were still very much respected and feared in Britain. So he holds a position of vast power and influence. And he is a very ambitious, very motivated person, but it is not a selfish motivation. Merlin also has a goal which sometimes runs parallel to Arthur's goal of reuniting Britain and sometimes does not. Merlin's main goal is to bring back the full power of the gods, which he believes had been interrupted by the occupation by the Romans and from the encroaching rise of Christianity. So you get that theme of paganism or druidic religion versus Christianity, which is very common in Arthurian retellings, that manifests itself through Merlin, and then as well, because of her connection to him, through Nimue in these books. Sorry, Pippin got a little bit excited in the background. But Merlin is a fantastic character. I think that I'm really, really happy that Cornwell decided to include him, because I think that he had debated whether or not he was going to put him in there. And I think that it works very well. And talking about Merlin is a good segue into chatting about the world building in this book. So I am not by any stretch of the imagination an expert on Dark Ages Britain, unless there were very obvious anachronisms. I don't know that I would necessarily pick them up, but from what I can tell, Cornwell has remained very true to this time period in terms of the interpersonal relationships, in terms of the military strategies and tactics, in terms of the social and cultural events, in terms of the religious beliefs, the changes in terms of religion in Britain. It all feels like it is very well done, very true to the time. You definitely feel like you are transported into Dark Ages Britain, which, as you can imagine, is not always a comfortable place to be. These books, while I wouldn't classify them as like the equivalent of grimdark for fantasy, they are very bleak. There is a lot of sadness, there is a lot of hardship, there is a lot of toil and loss and death and enslavement. Those are all very much a part of the world and the culture. So it can be difficult to read about at times, but I think that Cornwell handles it very well. He is able to make the characters come off as compassionate and caring about their fellow men, while also being products of their time. You know, he doesn't sugarcoat the atrocities that happened during this time, or the difficult necessities or the difficult parts of life. So I personally think that he did a great job. And how Merlin ties into that is through the use of magic and how magic is portrayed in this series. So, like I said, I would definitely classify this as historical fiction and not historical fantasy, because I did not see the way that magic, we'll put in quotes, the way that it is written into the story feels like the way that it probably felt to people who were living in that time. So Druidic magic is a part of Britain's culture. It is a part of their belief system. It is a part of how they worship. It is a part of their religion. And it is something that they very much believe in. And while you're reading it as a modern reader, it probably seems a lot like superstition, like a combination of superstition and coincidence and just cleverness on the part of Nimue or Merlin or whoever is on the page. But to me, I didn't ever feel like that Cornwell was writing something that we were supposed to believe was magic in the sense of like a Brandon Sanderson. Like, I don't think that there was a magic system in this book. I think that Cornwell showed us the types of beliefs and superstitions and rituals that were carried out at the time, and then it's left up to the reader whether or not you want to interpret those things as magic or you want to interpret them as rudimentary medicine or rudimentary science. But it's very, very fascinating. Like I said, it really feels like you are pulled into historical Britain. And I think that Cornwell does a great job of towing that line and of making you almost believe in the things that are happening, just as the people, the characters in this book, the Dervals and the Arthurs and the Kynwins, just as they would believe in these things that are happening, you as the reader also starts to believe in these things as they're happening. So I think that the world building was exquisite. Again, I don't think that it ventures over into fantasy territory, but it bring the integrating the Druidic magics, I think, really helps bring that world building to life and really makes you feel like you are part of the story. So absolutely fantastic. I so enjoyed seeing all that, and it felt, like I said, insofar as my limited experience can tell me, it felt very realistic. One thing that I do want to touch on, because this is something that when I initially started these books, it held me back a little bit. And that is, I'm going to call it like writing and formatting. So I have my copy of the book here. Now I think this is the Penguin. Yes, I have the Penguin edition. So this is a paperback, but it is a very tightly bound paperback. Now I have kind of loosened mine a little bit through reading and kind of keeping it open like this, which is probably blasphemy to some people who are watching. So it is a little bit looser than it was, but these are very tightly bound paperbacks. And the font is very small. And to me, it even like the typesetting even looks like something that I would expect in a history book. And I don't know if anybody else is like this, but for me, when books are bound very tightly, when the typeset is very small and it's a font that I'm not really used to looking at, I find that sometimes that can impact my reading experience. Combined with that, especially in the first part, so the books are all broken up into parts. The first part of book one, there is a lot of setting the stage. I call it world building, but they're real places. It's just establishing historical venues, the names of buildings, the names of castles, the names of people and their family members, and how they all fit into the political landscape of Britain. There's a lot of information that needs to get dumped on you. And I think that Cornwell does this as organically as he can. It is not like, oh, I'm sitting down in the classroom and giving you a history lesson of all the names of the people. They definitely come in and out of the story, and you learn little bits and pieces about them as they enter and exit the story. But it's still a lot of information to get and to try to retain. And one thing that held me back personally at the beginning of book one was the Welsh names. So Cornwell tried to, again, in a bid to try to maintain historical accuracy, used a lot of Welsh terminology, a lot of name places, a lot of the names of the people, which in traditional retellings, or I guess not traditional, in modern retellings, we are given the modernization of a lot of these traditionally Welsh names, and Cornwell did not do that. He included the traditional Welsh names, and unless you know how to read those words, then it's going to be difficult, I think, to retain them. So I'm just going to put some up on the screen because I read the first book and I had no clue how to pronounce a lot of these names. So first we have Derval. So when I read the first book, until Alan sent me a message calling him Derval, I called him Durfel. And Durfel is definitely not as nice a name as Derval. Derval definitely flows off the tongue a little bit better, but I thought this was Durfel. We also have Gorfithid, who is a character who comes up a lot in book one, and this, I would not have known to pronounce this Gorfithid. We have Chlamre, again, sorry for this like a butchering pronunciation, but this is Arthur's horse's name. Again, had no idea how to pronounce that. I still did a very poor job of pronouncing it, but it's difficult to keep these words in your mind when you're not really sure what you're reading. We also have Gwenhilvac, who is Guinevere's sister. We have Howlbane, that is not, I called this Hywellbane until I heard it pronounced correctly. We have Kersus, which is not what I would have called this word, but these are just like a handful of examples, the ones that stick out in my mind the most because they come up over and over. But there are tons of words, place names, people's names, animals' names that come up over the course of the novel. And at least for me, if I don't know how to pronounce something, I find it difficult to retain that information. And in a fantasy novel or a work of historical fiction where you have all of these players on the board and you need to keep them straight, and many of them have names that begin with the same consonant or even the same group of consonants, I found it hard to keep things straight without knowing how to pronounce them. And it really did impact my enjoyment of the beginning of book one. So this is where I will make my plea for you to at least try book one as an audiobook. And if you hate audiobooks and you can't listen to audiobooks, then by all means you can go out and listen to like some pronunciations. But even just doing that immersive reading that some people find really helpful, where you're listening and reading at the same time, I think it will be incredibly helpful, at least for part one of book one, because you do get introduced to a lot of the names then. And I think once they're in your mind, they're easy to keep there. For books 2 and book 3, I did a combination of audio and physical reading. I started off book 2 with the audio because Alan had said that it was fantastic, that the narrator was excellent, and that it really helped him with a lot of the pronunciation of all those words. But at times when the audio was too slow and I got so absorbed into the story, I needed to stop and read because I can read much faster than I can listen. And there were parts where I just couldn't wait any longer. I could not wait for the narrator to tell me what was happening because I needed to know instantly, which again, I think speaks volumes about the type of series that this is. There were parts where I was so involved, it was so intense that I had to stop listening so that I could read as quickly as possible. So if that doesn't sell you on the book, then I don't know what could. But yes, the audiobook, it was a fantastic reading experience. The narrator, Jonathan Keeble, does a great job. He does various voices for the different characters. He does excellent accents because we have characters who come from Ireland, and then we have characters who are British and characters who are coming over from across the sea. So he does a great job with all of those different characters, and he just has a very pleasant voice to listen to. So if you are at all interested in audiobooks, this would be one of the few experiences that I have ever had where I felt like the audiobook was absolutely necessary for my retention of what was happening, because it allowed me to listen to those words and to remember them. I would never have remembered Gorfithid's name or Kersus or any of those things if I had not heard them pronounced, because I needed to know what they were correctly in order to keep them in my mind. But overall, I do highly recommend the audiobook. And I think this just brings me to my overall impression of the book. If you could not tell from all of the gushing, I really loved this series. I don't want to get into specific moments because I think that we all know the basic structure of the Arthurian legend. We all know the high points and the low points and you know what ultimately is going to happen. But I think that Cornwell brings a lot of freshness to this legend. If this is a story that you feel like you know like the back of your hand, he will bring something new in it for you. You will be on the edge of your seat, either desperately hoping for something that you know is going to happen, not to happen, like is there some way we can rewrite this legend so that this doesn't happen at this moment? Or you'll be waiting to see how Cornwell positions the characters that he created, or the new personalities or the new facets of the personalities that he has given these characters, how those come to life, how those will impact the events of the story. It's phenomenal stuff. It's so fun to watch it all unfold. Once you get past the first part of the first book, the pacing is excellent. Books 2 and 3 especially, the pacing is almost breakneck. Once you get halfway through book 2, from there all the way through book 3, it's just this constant barrage of events that is happening. And even though you have that breakneck pace, you still get the integration of a lot of that character development and character work. There are moments that will move you to tears. There are moments where you will have to put the book down and just be like, what happened? Why? Why did that happen? And you will love it. I don't usually give like everybody should read this because I think different books appeal to different people, but there's so much in here that I think has such wide appeal. If you, like I said, if you love heroic fantasy, if you love historical fiction, if you love great characters, if you love battle sequences, then I think that if you love political intrigue, there's so much in these books, and they are so worth reading. They are, I think, as I said, overall in all of the Arthurian retellings that I have experienced, I think I would put these at number 2 for me. Mary Stewart's books have nostalgia, for one thing, because I read them at a young age. They have the element of historical fantasy. They have that element of magic that is not present in the same way in these retellings. So I think they will always come a little tiny bit above the Warlord Chronicles, but these are without a doubt some of my favorite books, one of my favorite trilogies that I have ever read, some of my new favorite characters in fantasy, and an audiobook experience that was absolutely phenomenal. So if you have heard a little bit about these books and you've been thinking about putting them on your TBR, do it. If they are on your TBR, bump them up. I cannot recommend them highly enough. If you have read them and you have any thoughts about them, then I would love to know your thoughts. Maybe some point in the future, some of us who have read these books might do a spoiler conversation. That would be really fun because I think there are a lot of really great moments in this series that I'm not going to touch on right now, but are totally worth discussing and worth exploring. So if you do have any spoilery thoughts, just enter down and spoiler hide them in the comments, but I would be happy to talk to you about it. You can hop onto Discord. I have been chatting with a couple of people on Discord about this series and would love to talk to anybody else who enjoyed them as much as I did. And I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye.